My name is Cadence Moffat McCann. I came to the name Cadence a bit later in life, and I understand it to mean mother of fluid harmony. And I'm still living into what that name means for me in my life and my place in the world. Moffat is my maternal surname, which is Scottish, and McCann is my paternal surname, which is Irish. And I currently live in the lands of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, who are also known as the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. And this is also known as Victoria, British Columbia, in so-called Canada or Turtle Island. And I currently facilitate workshops to help people connect with themselves, with each other, and with the earth. And I feel deeply honored and blessed to be able to show up in the world from a place of service in this way. And I thank you for inviting me to speak with you today.
Thank you. I would love to ask you, just for those people who are unfamiliar with it, about the practice of beginning with a land acknowledgement, actually.
That's a big question, and thank you for asking. So, as I mentioned, my ancestors are mostly from Europe. I also have some ancestry from Poland and Lithuania, but mostly my ancestors are Celtic. And so I identify as a settler here in these lands. Who have had original indigenous peoples here since time immemorial. So for thousands of years, there were peoples who tended these places from a place of sacred reciprocity. And I understand that for many indigenous peoples throughout Turtle Island, which is also known as NorthAmerica, there was a sense of kinship with all beings, with all life. And that to tend that relationship, it was tending a relationship with kin and with family. And so as a settler that has come here from a different land with a different culture and a different worldview, it is fundamental to recognize that there were indigenous peoples here and continue to be indigenous peoples here that are continuing to tend these places and these relationships and will continue to do so for, throughout time. And so the land acknowledgement is a very small piece of recognizing that relationship and those peoples, and that we are here as visitors and settlers, and that we are incredibly blessed to be here, and that we have a role in supporting a process of decolonization of these places.
Thank you. So coming to the reconnection to ourselves, to each other, and to the earth. And I love that because I feel it's coming up more and more in the spaces I go into anyway, as the fundamental work of these times. So this is a huge question, but what does that mean to you? What does that look like?
Another great question. Thank you. So at this point in my journey, I recognize that I am continually learning and growing. And what I share in this moment might be different from what I would share 5 years from now or 20 years from now. But that reconnecting is the fundamental piece that I feel like is missing in our modern dominant culture, where we have become very individualized and very separate. And so what I feel called to do in my life, and what I feel like we need as a species, is to come back into that connection. And for myself, I feel like it's a sense of remembrance, that we are part of the sacred web of life. We have always been so, we will always be so, and we just forget. There's a beautiful writer and teacher named Martin Prechtow, and he talks about us being beautiful amnesiacs, that it's so easy for us to forget these things. And there are so many things that we can do and need to do in order to help us remember. So it really is that process of building relationship once again, and coming back into connection and remembrance that all of life is wonderful and alive and amazing and waiting for us to connect and to appreciate and to deepen into that sense of reciprocity that I spoke of as well.
And through your work, what are some of the ways that you do that?
Mm. One of the fundamental practices that I weave into all of the work that I do, and I have different approaches to this work, but the fundamental practice is called a sit spot or a magic spot. And the invitation is I offer an opportunity for people to wander outside. So this could be in their own neighborhood or backyard if I'm doing an online offering. If it's in person, I'll invite people to wander in the park or in nature, wherever we are, and allow themselves to be called to a place. So it's really a process of listening and allowing the earth and the wild beings to invite you into a place. And then the invitation is to deepen into connection with that place. So asking permission, making sure that that place actually wants you to be there, as though you're engaging with another being, another alive being, which you are. And then the invitation is just to sit and to be in a place of openness and surrender and quiet listening, with all of your senses open, as though you're an animal in the forest, taking in the sounds with your deer ears wide open, taking in the scents. Maybe something might, pique your taste. Feeling your body deeply connected to the earth beneath you, and all of the other sensations that you can feel with the wind or the sun or the rain on your skin. And then opening your eyes to see everything, and just feeling that sense of that awe and wonder for life and for nature, and really just quieting the thinking mind and coming into a state of embodied presence, deep gratitude, love. And that's something that I invite people to do if they can every single day. The invitation is for 20 minutes, at least once a week. But, every time I do an offering, I create space for people to go and have some time to integrate on the land by themselves, without their phone and, without any distractions. And I feel like that's really one of the fundamental things that we can start doing. It's so easy, even if we're in a situation where in the middle of a city, or during certain circumstances with COVID, we can sit and be with a plant, or we can even step, open the window or sit on a porch. We don't have to be in the middle of the forest to be able to do this. We can do it anywhere that we are.
And I'd love to hear how you were called to doing this work.
Thank you. So I guess it really started when I went traveling for the first time, when I was 19. And so I grew up here in Lekwungen territory, and I just felt called to go as far away from home as I could. So I bought a ticket to Australia, and I spent 6 months traveling Australia, and then I spent a month traveling New Zealand, and then came through Southeast Asia on my way home. And it was really in New Zealand where I developed a deep connection to nature, because I just would go and spend time alone. Sometimes I would take my journal, sometimes I would just wander, but I would often find a spot near the water, at the ocean or a stream or a lake. And I started doing sit spots, which are, without even knowing that was what they were called, or that was a practice that other people did. It just felt really intuitive and natural to me. And really felt a fundamental shift in my life after that trip, where I just realized that I was part of this sacred web of life, and that I wanted to continue to devote my life to that. And so I came back to Canada, and through sort of a meandering journey through my studies at university, ended up studying Indigenous studies, and had this amazing opportunity to be in classes with Indigenous elders, with people from Indigenous communities that were knowledge holders and keepers. And such a rare experience as a settler here in North America to have the opportunity to do that. I'm so deeply grateful. And it was one of the most humbling times in my life of realizing, this, I was very young and very ignorant at the time, and just entered into these classes with an open heart and open mind, and learned so much um, about our place in the world as human beings. And one of the fundamental things that really landed for me and really took root from those courses was the importance of connecting with nature, and how fundamental the land is to our entire being. And I remember hearing this story once, and this was about an indigenous elder in South America, maybe Peru. And they had built a dam, and they were flooding her land. And I heard this story of her going down to the land that had been flooded and placing her hands on the earth and just sobbing, because her kin, her relatives, were being destroyed by this flood and this water. And that story just always, I get emotional sharing it now, and it touched me so deeply, and really made me realize that so many of us, in particular as settlers, are so disconnected from nature and from the earth and from the land. And so that really renewed my conviction that I needed to support people to reconnect. And so from when I finished my undergrad, I came back to Vancouver Island, and I started working as a wilderness guide and nature-based facilitator. And that was really where my journey began 15 years ago, doing that work with young people.
Wow. And so I have so many things I'd like to ask, but one thing that came up is I'm curious what it's like growing up in settler culture, what you're taught about Indigenous people compared to what you actually encounter when you meet them. Because I feel there's a sort of narrative almost that they don't exist anymore, right? There's this erasure. So how was it for you to suddenly realize that's not true?
Mm-hmm. So I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and this was one of the things that really hit me actually when I went traveling to Australia and New Zealand, because I was 19 and it was my first time like having a conversation with, I met some Aboriginal folks in Australia and some Maori folks in New Zealand. So it was the first time for me having a conversation with an Indigenous person. And I realized that growing up here, that erasure was so strong. I live now right across the waterway from the two reserves here in town. And so there was always an understanding that there were Indigenous peoples here. But in school, we never learned anything about them. I remember in grade 5, a social studies textbook, we had one page at the beginning of one of our history chapters that talked about historically Indigenous peoples being here. And that is the only time that I remember in my entire education from kindergarten to grade 12 learning anything about Indigenous peoples in Turtle Island. And when I went traveling, that it just really the lights went off, that is so wrong, and that I needed to come back and learn more about the original peoples here. And that was sort of where my journey began with engaging in Indigenous studies here. Things have shifted a little bit. There was a big process in Canada around reconciling the harms that were caused to students at the residential schools. So we did a Truth and Reconciliation Commission here, and that helped, I think, the average Canadian realize a little bit more of the history of Canada and understand a little bit more of really the horrific things that had happened to Indigenous peoples through colonization here. And we still have a long ways to go.
Yeah, for sure. So with your wilderness therapy and all of the stuff that you're doing, yeah, can you tell me about some of the transformations you've seen when people open themselves to nature?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I, as I mentioned, worked for 15 years, mostly with youth. And during that time, a lot of the youth that I worked with were quite vulnerable youth. So I worked in alternative education systems, these sort of fringe alternative outdoor ed programs within the mainstream education system. And most of the students that I worked with were really struggling in school for a number of reasons. Many of them came from really horrific home life situations. And so they came to this program um, to, as sort of a last resort, to try to help them find their way in the school system and in their lives beyond school as well. And so I have a lot of stories that I could share about experiences with youth, but I will share this one about this one student in particular who, again, this story just really landed in my heart, and I have always carried it forward. So this was when I was working in Vancouver, and was working with mostly inner city youth from East Vancouver, which is one of the roughest neighborhoods in all of North America, and was doing 10-day wilderness expeditions with these students. And most of these students lived in the city and could see the mountains on the north shore, so on the other side of the waterway that runs through the city, but had never been into the wilderness before. And so we would take them on day trips and slowly, try to ease them into these longer expeditions. But the big trips were still quite challenging for them because they were literally removed from their comfort zone and everything that was familiar to them in the city and taken into the middle of the wilderness, which was completely foreign to them. And so there was just a lot of challenges that they experienced. And during the duration of the trip, they would slowly start to let go of, some of that discomfort and start to feel a sense of belonging in nature. And so this one story is of this one student, and he had been in the program, I think, for an entire year already. And he was very resistant to everything that we tried to do. So we would start every morning with a circle just to check in and connect. And he would come in with his big hood up and, his headphones on and his body all scrunched down and just really grumpy and really like a lot of negative energy. And he had, some really intense challenges at home. Like, I have lots of empathy and compassion for him. But so we went on this kayaking trip, and he was a large person. I think he was about 6'5", so very tall. And it was really hard for him to fit in the kayak. It was a 10-day kayaking trip, and we had to jerry rig the seat so that he could get in and out of the boat. His legs were sore, and he was in physical discomfort. And so I fully heard that and understood that, and we did the best we could to make it more comfortable for him. But I remember a couple days into the trip, he came up to me and he said, "I don't understand. I don't get it why you're so happy out here." Because I would just have this childlike exuberance as soon as we would pull away from the city, I would start singing and just get, in my element and so excited to be out in nature. And he couldn't understand how I could feel so happy and joyful about being in nature. And so I said to him, I want you to try to find one thing that you can be excited about out here. It could be what you're going to eat for dinner. It could be, something very simple, but just one thing that you can look forward to in your day. And he sort of grumbled and, was still fairly resistant, but he's like, "Okay, whatever, I'll try." And so he walks away, and it might have even been the next day or the day after. We're paddling along, and I look over, and he's got jellyfish all over the spray skirt of his kayak on top of his boat. He's got all these pet jellyfish, and he even had one of his Nalgene water bottles filled with jellyfish. He got so excited about them, and he had sea stars and basically any marine creature that he could find, he adopted as his pet and carried with him wherever he would go. And it was so beautiful. And I remember it was maybe one of the last days of the trip, it was a trip of all male students. I was the only female on the trip, and they, had progressively gotten more rambunctious and excited about being in nature. And this last morning, this student in particular, he was the one leading the charge of all of the students down to the intertidal zone to find crabs and to just explore and be kids and be excited. And I have this picture of him where he brought this crab back up to camp. And I have this photo of him where he's got his hood off and his hair pulled back off his face and a huge grin from ear to ear. And he's holding this crab right at the forefront of the frame of the photo. And it's just this like 180-degree transformation from within that trip. And so it just like that story, I have so many stories like that I could share, but that one really just captures how amazing it is to be in nature with people and to see how much shift and growth can happen from such a short time of just connecting with nature.
I love that story. It's so nice. So maybe the last thing I'd love to ask you is, you shared that book that's behind you with me last time, The Lost Words, and I'm just wondering if people watching have had that same curiosity, like, hey, what's that book? So yeah, could you tell us really briefly what it is and why it's so important?
Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll just pull it out so people can see it a little bit.
Yeah, that'd be good.
So this book, it was actually shared with me by a friend, and it's written by Robert McFarlane and Jackie Morris. And the premise of it is that the Oxford English Children's Dictionary removed a bunch of nature words from the dictionary to replace them with mostly words based around technology. And so these two people decided to create this book to save these words for the children. And so they embarked on this journey of, deciding which words that had been removed, and as I look through it, there's some of the words are like these words that that I use so commonly in my life. And I'm just going to pull up the table of contents, but it's like acorn and conquer and kingfisher and words of animals and creatures and natural beings that I have a personal relationship with. And to think that kids growing up today would not be able to learn about them, it's just a dictionary, but it symbolizes so much. And so I just really feel that this book is so important for helping us remember these words and helping us pass these words on to our future generations. And I actually have a really beautiful story about this. So I have a 12-year-old niece, and last summer, we were right in the middle of COVID lockdowns. And one of the things that I think is actually a really beautiful gift or a hidden silver lining to COVID is that I think it's helped a lot of people connect more deeply with nature, because we're not able to engage in some of the other human things that we would have done before. And so we can go and spend time by ourselves or maybe with one or two other people in nature. And I spent quite a bit of time with my 12-year-old niece last summer in the forest, and actually in my neighborhood. We did a lot of foraging, of urban foraging in my neighborhood and foraging in the forest. And then we would come back to my place and we would make potions and teas and tinctures and, just whatever we wanted to create with the things that we had gathered from the land. And she was over one day and she saw this book and she went right to it and she pulled it off the shelf and she opened it up on my bed and she was looking through it, and her reaction was so beautiful. She was like, I am appalled. This is preposterous. Like, how is this possible? She was just like so shocked that these words could have been taken out of the dictionary. And it's a beautiful book. They've done, all of the artwork is hand painted, and it's just this masterpiece. And I just, really resonated with everything that she was saying and her reaction and her response to it. So I highly recommend this book. I think it should be in every school, library, and classroom. But really, just we need to remember these things, and we need to not let our young people and future generations forget that they matter.
Yeah, otherwise it's another erasure, isn't it? Yeah. So thank you so much for speaking to me today. I feel like I'd love to just continue this conversation for hours, but I've learned with my last podcast to try and keep things shorter, just how people are very overwhelmed these days. But yeah, maybe another time I'd love to delve into some other topics with you. Is there anything else that feels important to share before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think the main thing that I am feeling, I actually, in preparation for this chat with you today, I went and walked the forest, and I asked if there was anything that wanted me to share. And the main message that I received was that as a human species, we in so many ways have lost our way. And for us to remember, we really just need to slow down and be present and listen and recognize that there are so many messages and so much wisdom and guidance that is available to us from nature, from the trees, from the birds, from spirit. And that in that slowing down and listening is actually one of the ways that we can move forward.
Yeah, I'm getting that calling a lot at the moment. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much for joining me today.